Buenos días a todas, a todos. Muchas gracias a la Fundación Pluralismo y Convivencia por la oportunidad de estar aquí hoy, esta mañana. En las sociedades formalmente democráticas y económicamente desarrolladas, la gran asignatura pendiente de la política, con mayúscula, es la gestión de la creciente diversidad cultural e identitaria y, por tanto, también religiosa, de sus poblaciones. Hablamos de una gestión democrática cuya complejidad salta a la vista, pero cuya necesidad aumenta como consecuencia de los movimientos de población y de los procesos de globalización con los cambios que conllevan en los medios de comunicación y relación sociales. La democracia hoy no puede reducirse a un concepto formal y rígido que equivale a la extensión generalizada del derecho de sufragio, ni tampoco a una mera regla numérica. Por el contrario, una idea más profunda e intensa de democracia debe vertebrar todo el sistema jurídico político, empezando por su legitimación más básica, esto es, el reconocimiento, respeto y garantía de los derechos humanos de todas las personas. Derechos que los ciudadanos deben poder ejercer a través de su respectiva identidad, aunque sea minoritaria, y no a pesar de ella. Estamos, por tanto, hablando de aplicar una lectura más plural e inclusiva de los derechos fundamentales, incluido el derecho a la libertad de religión, el derecho a no ser discriminado por razón de creencias o el derecho de los miembros de las minorías religiosas a profesar su propia confesión. Canadá ha sido, desde los años 70, uno de los países referentes en la gestión inclusiva de la diversidad a través de políticas multiculturalistas o, como se prefiere en Quebec, interculturalistas. La cláusula multicultural en su Constitución, las leyes sobre multiculturalismo o las políticas multi- e interculturalistas de sus distintas provincias avalan dicha posición. Esto no obstante, los discursos críticos con la diversidad se revitalizaron en todo el planeta a partir del 11 de septiembre de 2001 y se agudizaron particularmente en el caso de Quebec en torno a los años 2006 y 2007 con la conocida como crisis de los acomodos. Aquel contexto concreto motivó que el Gobierno de Quebec anunciara en febrero de 2007 la creación de la Comisión de Consulta sobre las prácticas de acomodo relativas a las diferencias culturales, presidida por el filósofo Charles Taylor y el historiador y sociólogo Gérard Bouchard. Tras una intensísima labor de investigación y participación sociales y numerosas actividades y discusiones, el informe de la Comisión fue publicado en mayo de 2008. Casi 6 años después de aquella comisión, es tiempo de efectuar un balance de la experiencia y de señalar sus aspectos positivos y negativos que pudieran ser útiles a sociedades que, como la española, afrontan hoy la convivencia en una diversidad cultural creciente y hasta cierto punto novedosa. Canadá y España presentan importantes diferencias, pero comparten también algunas características sociales y políticas, por lo que el análisis del desarrollo de los discursos y las políticas sobre diversidad religiosa de aquella sociedad constituye un referente interesante para nuestras instituciones y nuestro modelo de sociedad futura. En particular, una adecuada gestión de la creciente diversidad religiosa en un marco laico de convivencia es uno de los retos que más debate han suscitado y suscitan en Quebec y sobre el que esta ponencia puede ofrecernos interesantísimas ideas y reflexiones. Y para ello tenemos la inmensa suerte de contar con nosotros con uno de los 2 presidentes de aquella comisión y un gran experto en políticas de gestión de la diversidad, el profesor Gérard Bouchard. Antes de nada, debo agradecer al profesor Bouchard, en nombre de la organización de este Congreso, su presencia hoy en Madrid y su disposición a contribuir con sus reflexiones e ideas en este Congreso. Gérard Bouchard tiene un currículum tan extenso y prolífico que es imposible que pueda hacer una síntesis del mismo mínimamente representativa en unos pocos segundos. Esto, no obstante, recordaré que Gérard Bouchard es sociólogo e historiador, licenciado por la Universidad de Laval, doctorado por la Universidad de París, catedrático de la Universidad de Québec a Chicoutimi, concretamente en el Departamento de Ciencias Sociales, y ha sido profesor invitado en diferentes universidades, incluyendo algunas tan prestigiosas como la Universidad de París o la Universidad de Harvard. Como investigador tiene una dilatada y prestigiosa carrera, habiendo ocupado diversos puestos académicos, como la dirección del SOREP, Instituto Interuniversitario para la Investigación de la Población, del proyecto Balzac, de la Cátedra Canadá sobre Imaginarios Colectivos, o participando del Comité Consultivo del Programa de Sociedades Exitosas del Instituto Canadiense para la Investigación Avanzada. Y como todos ustedes saben o imaginan, la lista de publicaciones del profesor Bouchard es extensísima, incluyendo libros, alrededor de 40, artículos en revistas científicas, más de 280, y numerosísimas contribuciones a congresos nacionales e internacionales que superan las 600. Ha recibido igualmente varios premios y reconocimientos a lo largo de su carrera, tanto académicos como literarios. Solo por citar algunos de ellos, mencionaré que en el año 2002 recibió el título de Caballero de la Legión de Honor de la República Francesa y que, entre otras, ha sido investido doctor honoris causa por la Universidad de Moncton, en New Brunswick, y por la Universidad McGill de Montreal. Bien, creo que con esta presentación mínima es más que suficiente y yo lo que quiero es agradecer al profesor Bouchard su presencia aquí, darle la bienvenida a España. Es un enorme placer tener la posibilidad de presentarle y, sin más, le doy la palabra. Vous avez la parole.
Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, buenos días. First, I would like to thank Professor Ruiz Vieytez for his very generous introduction. I'm also grateful to the Foundation Canada, the Foundation Pluralismo y Conferencia, and the Canadian Embassy for making my visit possible here. I always enjoy visiting Madrid and Spain. As a matter of fact, Madrid was in 1968 the destination of our honeymoon trip, my wife and I. We were staying at a small hotel on this very street, Calle de Alcalá, and after almost half a century, I'm still living with the same wife. So Madrid has been a good destination for us. And it is also a tremendous testimony regarding the possibility of managing diversity. And finally, there might be hope for a future for the world from that. And I also appreciate the short break with the Arctic Quebec winter right now. My lecture has two goals. First, I would like to briefly report on the inter-ethnic tensions that arose in Quebec in the years 2004, 2008, the so-called accommodation crisis. I think that what happened in Quebec and the way we have handled the situation might be of some interest for non-Quebecers. And second, I will outline the guiding principles that inform the Quebec framework regarding the management of ethnocultural diversity, including religious diversity, a framework known as interculturalism. And here I will rely first on the report that Charles Taylor and I have produced in 2008 as co-chairs of a governmental commission, and second on a book that I have just published on interculturalism. It has been published in French, but an English version will be released next spring. First, a word about Quebec, for those who might not be familiar with this society. It is one of the 10 provinces of Canada with a population of 8 million. It comprises an Anglophone minority, which accounts for around 7% of the population, and other minority groups from various backgrounds and accounting for about 13% of the population. 18% of Quebecers have French as their mother tongue, and between 72 and 75% are Francophones of French-Canadian ancestry. They constitute the old stock culture, what I will call the founding or the majority culture in Quebec, meaning the descendants of the first European settlers at the beginning of the 17th century. And altogether, they represent what I will call the majority culture in Quebec. This short depiction is obviously a shortcut for the sake of this presentation, since there is, of course, no denying that the real founders of Quebec population are the native people, whose number hovers around 75,000 nowadays. Quebec Francophones, as I said, constitute a majority culture within Quebec, but they are also a minority, accounting for around 23% of the Canadian population and 2% of the North American population. So among all the characteristics of Quebec, this minority status is paramount, as we will see in the following presentation. So there is this double status with Quebec, a majority culture within and a minority without. This is very important. I have alluded to an accommodation crisis. What exactly happened? Since the 1970s, Quebec has developed a quite efficient model, a quite efficient approach to ethnocultural diversity. And overall, I would say that its record in this area is widely positive, or was highly positive. I will come back to this later on. One feature of this approach since the 1980s is the widespread practice of what we call reasonable accommodations, a practice consisting in changing not the law itself, but some modalities of its application when it does not entail an undue, excessive hardship in terms of cost, administrative burden, and so forth. Moreover, in order for a demand to be granted, it must not impinge on other people's rights, and it must not violate what is considered in Quebec as fundamental values, basically the values that are enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The goal of accommodations is always to better realize the ideal of equality, to avoid discrimination against individuals possessed of a distinctive condition of some sort that set them apart from the mainstream population. It can be a physical handicap, it can be a linguistic threat, or it can be a particular religious belief and practice. Now, bear in mind that those accommodation demands usually arise in situations where two rights come into conflict in their application. For instance, should a sick motorcyclist be obliged to wear a helmet in the name of security or not, in the name of freedom of religion? And as we know, no right, even fundamental right, is absolute or unlimited. So an arbitration, a difficult arbitration, must be made in those situations. According to the basic principle, a true university of right calls for some flexibility in their application, and they may involve difficult decisions to be made in situations of conflict. And this practice had become part of daily life in Quebec, in public institutions, for years, without generating any serious questioning or protest. And suddenly, from the turn of the century, they became a major public issue. And they came to be perceived as a set of privileges incompatible with democracy, a violation of the rule of law, a threat to the Quebec common values, especially the value of men-women equality, and even a threat to the founding majority culture. And soon, interethnic tensions developed, and the immigrants, along with the members of minorities, became the target of a quite negative discourse. So I guess this may sound familiar to a European audience as well. It is in such, in this context that in February 2007, the Quebec government decided to set up a commission of consultation to investigate the matter and to come up with recommendations. The commission was, as mentioned, co-chaired by Charles Taylor, the well-known political philosopher, and myself. It has been active for 15 months, and its report was released in May 2008. Thanks to a generous budget, we've been able to fund numerous research projects, to consult with dozens of experts, to meet with more than 30 focus groups, and to operate a website which recorded close to 500,000 visits during 1 year. We have also received and analyzed 1,000 briefs from different components of the population, including individuals. And we have held more than 30 days of public hearings in 16 regions, along with 26 forums across the province. And I will say a little word about those forums. Those were open mic town meetings, open to the general public, without any selection or restriction. And they attracted an average of about 200 people. They were broadcasted live by 2 or 3 television networks, and they were widely watched and discussed for months everywhere across the province. At the outset, and in the course of our mandate, everybody was referring to the events that we had to investigate as a crisis, the accommodation crisis, as it came to be known. And the media, as you may or you may not guess, were having a field day with the public debates and the statements, sometimes a little bit unexpected by the ordinary people that came to the mic. And the media were chasing after the most strange, outlandish demands of accommodation, even inventing as the need arose, while the whole province was busy day and night discussing the issue. According to the common view, there was something terribly wrong in the Quebec public institutions and the practice of accommodation. And this common view held that a radical overhaul was required. And finally, after months of close investigation, we came to rather different conclusions. According to our analysis, there was no accommodation crisis whatsoever. It was business as usual in schools, hospitals, and other public institutions. Most demands of accommodations were handled very carefully through a combination of flexibility on the modalities and firmness on the principles. We also believe that the Quebec culture was not threatened by the practices of accommodations. For example, the basic values were not infringed upon, and the law was not bent to meet the petitioners' expectations. So this was not a way to make ourselves very popular among the Quebec population, because we were running against the common views and fears. Nevertheless, we believe that there was a crisis indeed, but the crisis was in the perceptions of the accommodation practices and not in the practices themselves. And those groundless misperceptions had been very largely created by a media frenzy, which had blown out of proportions minor incidents, distorting the facts, and again, they went as far as inventing facts. We were able to demonstrate that. Now, undoubtedly, the popular emotion that ensued would not have been possible without a background of permanent insecurity among the Francophone Quebecers, a minority culture, as I said, facing a growing waves of immigrants. And let me summarize the major problems and challenges and some conundrums that Charles Taylor and I were facing in this context. On the one hand, the media were clearly a major factor in the making of this so-called crisis, and we felt duty-bound to criticize their behavior, and that's what we did. On the other hand, we knew very well that we would need them to disseminate the conclusions of our report and to promote our recommendations. Though this was a very difficult situation, to court the media, but at the same time to criticize them. I'm not sure that we've been very successful in doing that anyway. Second, there was a strong popular frustration and some aggressiveness directed against the Quebec elites as a whole, the lawmakers, the intellectuals, the social leaders, the academics like Taylor and I. And a lot of people felt that major consequential decisions regarding immigration and the future of Quebec as a francophone society had been made without any consultation. The focus groups that we have met were particularly outspoken on this score. People were complaining that they had been told only after the fact about the implications of those decisions. For instance, to allow a growing number of immigrants from different parts of the world with very diversified backgrounds and so forth. Third, we could observe a strong, widespread feeling of cultural insecurity. The francophone culture was said to be seriously threatened, a feeling that had various sources. The fear of the Muslim terrorism, the conviction that the Muslims were reluctant to integrating the mainstream culture, that their values were incompatible, that they were illiberal. That many people worried about the Charter of Rights, fearful that the rule of law would be relaxed only to please the immigrants. There was also a widespread concern about the legacy of the 1960 Quiet Revolution, that is, a tradition of secularism, the value of gender equality, and French as the official language of the public life in Quebec had their future threatened by the number of immigrants. In short, we had to convince people that those fears were either exaggerated or groundless, and that was not an easy task. Fourth, as I said, Francophone Quebec is a minority in North America, and understandably, there is a sense of fragility that infuses this culture. It is sometimes very strong, sometimes weaker. It depends on the context. It goes and flows like that. But at the time of the report, there was a great sensitivity to this fragility factor. But at the same time, this continental minority is a majority within Quebec, where their members control the major public and private institutions, and as such, they are entrusted with important collective responsibilities towards the minority, for instance. The problem is sometimes this majority behaves like a minority in its relationship with its own minorities, which happen to harbor their own sense of fragility, as it always happened with immigrants and ethnocultural minority. The outcome in this case is an encounter of anxieties, a combination of insecurities, which is not good for a society. And this is what happens when a majority feels threatened by its minorities. And it happens very often. Another problem consisted in what I call the Muslim paradox. And it is not specific to Quebec. Quebec Francophones would very much like Muslims to integrate, but they often associate them with the risk of radicalism and fundamentalism, even terrorism. So they keep sending them mixed messages, which in turn lead some moderate Muslims to actually radicalize and self-marginalize in Quebec society. And as a result, this behavior is likely to generate the very outcome that was dreaded in the first place. This is what I call the Muslim paradox. Sixth, the religion brought in by immigration and expressed in the public place, including the public institutions, were another source of great discomfort. We discovered that a number of xenophobic individuals concealed their true feeling behind a progressive discourse of secularism and republicanism. such that it became very difficult to disentangle this syncretism. Suddenly people who were very obviously xenophobic were transformed into Republican, thinkers. But this was a way to reject religious signs and differences in the public life and so forth. They would not say that because we hate them, that because we endorse the Republican ideal of secularism and that sort of things. Seventh, as I will show in a moment, Quebec interculturalism promotes exchange and interaction between the majority and the minority cultures. It is then predictable that along this process, all cultures, majority and minorities, are bound to change. But this was a perspective that a number of Francophones fiercely rejected. This idea that immigrants would change the mainstream culture, the tradition of the host country, was something that they were strongly reluctant to. And finally, just like in most Western nations today, Taylor and I were facing the well-known challenge, or should I say the conundrum again, of defining a national overarching culture or identity that would be at once meaningful to and respectful of all ethno-cultural components, including the founding majority, of course. So this is I would say, the basic challenge that is facing not only Quebec society, but all Western democracy and other countries. How to redefine the symbolic foundations of a society amid diversity. This is an invitation to revisit the old national myth, the old traditions, the worldviews, to accommodate diversity. But how far should we go in that direction? And we meet a strong resistance of the whole society going down that road. Now I would like to say a word about the philosophy or the orientations that we have chosen to set forth. I can't review all of them, but I will mention the most significant. First, in every matter, we always sought to work in a spirit of compromise and looking for equilibrium in the arbitration of incompatible or conflictual views and rights and expectations and so forth. I offer two examples. The public education system is secularized in Quebec. But in our view, this does not preclude the presence of religious signs in the schools, like the wearing of the hijab. A second example, state employees, according to our stance, should be allowed to wear religious signs, except for those who are endowed with coercion power. And in our view, this was not in contradiction with the institutional separation of state and church. The institutional separation of church and state should not implicate that the employees of the state would be forbidden to wear religious signs. We didn't see any contradiction between those two dimensions. Second orientation, we rejected any suggestion to privatize, so to speak, religious diversity. We assumed that the best way to deal with religious diversity is to let it be seen and domesticated in the daily life, in public places, in hospitals, in public administration, and most of all, again, at school. We relied on the belief that the sooner a child experiences diversity, the easier he or she will deal with it as an adult. And in addition to that, according to our vision of what we call in Quebec open or inclusive secularism, without, again, that state employees should be allowed to wear religious signs at work as part of a fundamental right and in keeping with pluralism. We also believe that this provision does not threaten and is fully compatible, again, with the principle of institutional separation of state and church. Third, we defined accommodation or harmonization practices as a whole, especially the public and private institutions, and not only of the legal system. Actually, we encourage people to use the courts marginally, only as a last resort, and to develop a culture of mediation and negotiation in the day-to-day life. As someone has said this morning, I don't remember exactly, he was not the minister, but an important people anyway. He said that everybody in a society is a stakeholder in this regard. And this is exactly the perspective that we've been working in. The courts are expensive. The lawyers will not like this part of my presentation. The courts are expensive. They are time-consuming. And very often they antagonize. I mean, they make win-lose decisions. Whereas non-legal processes at the grassroots levels are more likely to reach win-win solutions. And this is an orientation that calls for a decentralization of the conflict resolution process. We thought that a diversified, pluralist society should promote a spirit of mutual adaptation. And again, this echoes things that were told at the beginning of this session. This may look a little bit idealistic, but we could observe it in Quebec in the last decades, and particularly in the last years. We had the opportunity, I'm referring again to the Commission, to the work we've done, Tolu and I, the opportunity to see the culture of negotiation in the daily life of public institutions, particularly in the education and the health systems. We had a lot of meetings with professionals working in those institutions and the way they were dealing with demands of accommodations and diversity and so forth. And we realized that they had developed an impressive expertise in dealing with those problems and reaching solutions in the spirit of compromises again. So we were very much impressed by this expertise and by the practical knowledge that has been developed over the years, and the population visibly did not know anything about that. The common view was that the immigrants were deciding, at his or her will and doing whatever they wanted. And the Quebecers were, okay, if that's what you want, that's fine. We're pluralist, we respect diversity, so you can do everything. This was the common view. This was not the practice at all that we were able to observe. Besides, what integration framework, interculturalism or any other, can realistically function if it is not based on a core of shared views and values on a common set of habitus, if I can use Pierre Bourdieu's concept here. Most of all, we have tried to bolster the Quebec framework of integration known as interculturalism. This is a framework that has been progressively developed in Quebec over the last decades, starting in the 1970s. In 1971, when the Canadian government enacted the multiculturalism policy, the Premier of Quebec, who was a liberal, not a separatist, as we might think, was a liberal, wrote to the Canadian Prime Minister and declared that Quebec was not adopting multiculturalism because it did not fit the needs and the characteristic of the Quebec population, and that Quebec would develop its own model to manage diversity. And that's what Quebec did. And the result is interculturalism that has been developed and applied progressively in the Quebec public life. Now, I will only stress some core features of this approach. One assumption of Canadian multiculturalism is that there is no majority culture in Canada, and there is no national culture. There is only a collection of citizens and ethnic groups. And this is consistent with the Canadian demography. I mean, the former dominant Anglo or British descent group today in Canada accounts only for about 1/3 of the population. So there is no longer a demographic majority in Canada. And this makes sense with the postulate of Canadian multiculturalism, that there is no majority culture. This makes perfectly sense with this society. But this assumption is a non-starter in Quebec, because there is clearly a majority culture in Quebec. This is the Francophone culture. And this culture is all the more salient since it is a minority culture in the North American environment, with again this sense of fragility and so forth. So this is the major difference between interculturalism and interculturalism. The finality of interculturalism is to manage in a decent way, according to the principles of pluralism, to manage the relationship between the majority and the minorities. This is the way ethnocultural reality are to be seen in Quebec and are to be approached. So this is a very different approach compared to the multiculturalism approach. They're dealing with individual rights and ethnic groups. There is no majority. And finally, you could even say that as a consequence, there is no minorities in Canada, formally. Another assumption of Canadian multiculturalism is that the English language is not threatened. And multiculturalism does not have much to say about language per se. And again, this is fine. English happens to be the language spoken in the United States, and it is also the language of globalization, so nobody in English Canada worry about the future of their national language. And again, this is very different in Quebec, where the French language is a matter of almost daily concern, and the Francophone culture, as I said, is this minority. Just like Canadian multiculturalism, Quebec interculturalism has been construed as a pluralist, liberal framework, but in a spirit of compromise, because, again, of the status of this majority Francophone culture, such that it takes into account the structural characteristic of the Quebec population and the ethnocultural landscape. Interculturalism is fundamentally built on a tension between the continuity of the Francophone culture and the diversity brought in by immigrants and the minorities. So we could say that there is a tension between the continuity of the founding culture and the diversity. In other words, a combination of culture as roots and culture as encounters. This is the way we have to manage diversity in Quebec. Now, this tension must not be seen as a problem, not as detrimental, but as something positive, as something creative, as a source of flexibility, as a dynamic of constant negotiations, mutual adaptations to public debates, and as a source of enrichment. This is the way we should look at it. It must not be seen either as a hindrance that somewhere down the road will be finally overcome and will disappear. This is not the way we should look at it. On the contrary, it must be seen as a permanent feature, this majority-minority relationships. And I would even say that it must be preserved in the name of pluralism, because the resolution of this tension would only be achieved at the expense of one of its constitutive parts, either continuity of diversity, or more to the point, at the expense of the majority or the minority culture. As long as they are members, citizens, who want to preserve their culture of origins, they will be minorities. So the idea that interculturalism would have as the goal to suppress minorities in the long run is wrong. This is not the goal of interculturalism. Minorities will always exist out of the will of their members. And this is the same thing for the majority. A second underpinning principle of interculturalism is reciprocity. It informs the definition of integration as a two-way process as a shared responsibility of the host society and the newcomers. It establishes negotiation as a fundamental mechanism. It calls for a widespread practice of accommodation. And it means that both majority and minority cultures are engaged in a process of simultaneous interrelated change and mutual adaptation. And finally, I will cut short in expounding the components of interculturalism, because I would like to say something about the future of interculturalism. I think that a number of countries in Europe have thought about managing the diversity through what I call a diversity paradigm. And this is a trend where multiculturalism grows. And for many reasons, some good and some less good, multiculturalism has fallen now in disfavor. Multiculturalism is very much criticized. It is rejected as the formula to manage diversity in Europe. And I think that most European countries are now shifting from the paradigm of diversity to another paradigm that I call duality. That is, to envision a society as being made up of a majority and minorities. And quite obviously, this shift toward the duality paradigms is boosted by the fear of the minorities, and particularly, of course, the Muslim minority. So when this phenomenon appears in a society, so that there is something like a majority who becomes worrying about its minorities, then this is the ground for interculturalism. Because interculturalism is designed to manage the relationship between the perception of a majority and minorities. So what I am saying is that there is, I think, a great future for interculturalism now in the Western world, if not beyond, in countries like Japan and so forth. And it is exactly in line with a decision that has been made by the Council of Europe in 2008, after a year of consultation among its 47 member states. Question was, what kind of models should be promoted to be acting in favor of a good management of diversity in Europe? And the 47 countries, after 1 year, came to a consensus, which is a quite rare occurrence, but they came to a consensus. First of all, they agreed that they should reject models that promote fragmentation. Multiculturalism, of course, was fingered. They should reject models that promote assimilation, and there was a little bit of French Republican that was fingered in this part. And they agreed that they should be looking for an in-between model. And according to their consensus, this model should be interculturalism. So I think that I don't believe interculturalism is a replacement or a substitute or a better model than multiculturalism, not at all. And there is a great varieties of multiculturalism. The Canadian multiculturalism is something very different from the Australian multiculturalism. They are different from the multiculturalism that was practiced in Great Britain and so forth. So this is not the matter of the discussion. But I think that because of the way things and societies are evolving now in the Western world, there is an emergence of a situation, of a background, for which interculturalism is specifically designed. And that's what I think that we should pay attention to this model, and we should discuss the issues that we're facing, looking very closely at what interculturalism sets forth. I thank you very much.